All right, welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to talk about Objective 12.2, describe the structures and functions of the female reproductive system. And you can find all these diagrams on Canvas and print them out and kind of fill them in as you watch the video. So here's a view of the female reproductive system. Let's orient ourselves. This right here is a bone. That's going to be like your pubic bone or like the front of your hips. And then this is your bladder, your urethra. So this is where urine comes out. Here's the vagina and the uterus. This is where like blood or the baby would come out. And then back here, this is the large intestine, making this the anus. So one more time in order, urethra for urine, the vagina for blood, and the anus for poop. And this is a one case where the reproductive role of the female is actually more complex than that of the male. Pretty much the only thing the male does is produce gametes. The female also produces gametes, but she has to nurture a fetus for approximately 9 months. So, lots to cover here. We're going to start with the external genitalia, which is basically everything out here that, like, if you take a mirror and look, the stuff that you can see from the outside, and it's more commonly known as the vulva. I also want to mention that it was originally called the pudendum, which is actually means shameful. So whatever man first discovered this stuff a couple hundred years ago decided to call it shameful. Also, most of the names we're going to talk about are named after men. Just something to keep in mind. All right, starting off with mons pubis. That means mountain on the pubis. It is a fatty, rounded area that's right on top of the pubic symphysis, and this is where like pubic hair would grow after puberty. Then down here, this outer fold of skin is called the labia majora, or like major lip, large lips. And this is basically a fold of skin that also contains fatty tissue, and it kind of covers up the vagina and protects it a little bit. And this labia majora would also be covered in hair after puberty. And then internal to the labia majora is the labia minora, or little lips, and this is just another skin fold, but this one does not have any hair on it. And then moving up, that little protrusion right there, along with all of this tissue that's covered blue, is the clitoris. And this is erectile tissue in a female. Erectile tissue means that it becomes full of blood and enlarges during sexual arousal. It's not like a penis erection, like it's not so big that you can see it, but it still happens. The clitoris contains many, many nerves, which makes it sensitive to touch and contributes to the female sexual response. Next, back here, there are these little about pea-sized glands near the vagina. They're known as the greater vestibular glands. This area right here is sometimes called vestibule, which means entryway. So it's like entrance to the vagina. But anyway, those glands are the greater vestibular glands, and their purpose is to release mucus into the vestibule. They help keep it moist and lubricated, which also helps facilitate intercourse. If you'll permit me to use some slang, sometimes you hear people say, like, a female becomes wet. What they actually mean when they say wet is that the greater vestibular glands have started producing mucus, similar to the bulbourethral glands in a male. Now we're going to move on to internal genitalia, starting off with the vagina. The vagina is also known as the birth canal. This is where the baby would come out during birth. This is also where blood comes out when you're on your period. And it's the female copulatory organ because this is where the penis goes during intercourse. And if you want fertilization to happen, the penis needs to ejaculate in the vagina. So we want the semen to get in there. I want to point out that it has ridges, like it's not a smooth structure, and those ridges are to be able to stimulate the penis during intercourse. Also, at the external opening right here, sometimes the mucosal layer extends into kind of like a partition or like a little thin covering called the hymen. The hymen is it varies from person to person. So sometimes they're fairly strong and they might not break until you actually have intercourse for the first time. Or other times they might break because you're riding a horse or running around or the first time you put a tampon in. So for a long time, people would like look at a female and see if her hymen was intact or not and use that to determine virginity. But that is not a valid method because it can break so many other ways. And I even have a friend whose hymen was actually so strong that she had to have it surgically cut. So, a lot of variation. Next, at the back of the vagina is the cervix. Remember the cervical vertebra of the neck? That's where cervix gets its name from because it's called the neck of the uterus, or basically like the outside of the uterus. Most of the month, the cervix has a little cervical mucus plug right here. So you can see there's a little passageway from the vagina into the uterus. Sperm needs to travel up the vagina and into the uterus for fertilization to occur. And if there's a little mucus plug right here, it's going to block things. Normally, that's a good thing because all of that bacteria that enters the vagina when you have sex is not going to be able to enter the uterus, but it would also be able to prevent pregnancy. So when a woman ovulates, the cervical mucus actually thins, and that's why you might notice that you find discharge in your underwear like a few days a month. So kind of like a white or yellowish fluid. That is your cervical mucus plug thinning. Next, the uterus itself is known as the womb. If fertilization occurs, this is where the embryo develops. And if you haven't had a baby yet, your uterus is supposed to be about the size of your fist, but kind of like more of a pear shape. After birth, it enlarges and it never goes back to being quite as small. Connected to the uterus are the uterine tubes, more commonly known as fallopian tubes, but fallopian is a guy's last name, so I prefer calling them uterine tubes or oviducts. It's their job to be able to receive the egg once it's been ovulated. So the egg would travel up the uterine tube right here, and this is actually where fertilization would occur, and then it would implant in the uterus. The egg is ovulated from the ovary, that white structure right there, but notice it looks very similar to the testicles. This is the primary reproductive organ in a female. Its job is to make gametes or egg cells, and it also makes the female sex hormones estrogen and progesterone. If you look closely, the ovary is actually not directly connected to the uterine tube, like it's not a closed system. The uterine tube ends in these little projections called fimbriae, and when the ovary releases an egg, the fimbriae kind of swing and they kind of help propel the egg into the uterine tube so that it can make its pathway there. Here is a nice video about ovulation. I want to recommend watching so you can actually see the fimbriae in action. And nice candy view of everything we just talked about. And here's a view of the uterus. So right here we have vagina, here we have the cervix where your cervical mucus plug would be, and then here's the uterus. And it's been cut open so that we can actually take a look at the uterine wall. But do you notice like that inner part right here is like a light pink color? That's called the endometrium. Endo means inner. It's an inner mucosal layer where the embryo would implant. And this is also the layer you shed when you have your period. Then the thick muscular layer in between is the myometrium. These are the muscles that you can blame for your period cramps and also the reason women can expel babies. So, massively thick muscle layer. And then finally, everything enclosed by an outer perimetrium. And this is maybe a more helpful view where you can actually see how the fimbriae would have to kind of swish the egg in there because they're not connected. Here is a view of the female perineum. So again, it's the area basically between the anus and the clitoris. And just as comparison with the male, this is where all the female genitalia are located. So the female vulva. To orient ourselves, that is the vagina. The hole directly above that is the urethra, where the urine would come out, and then up here is the clitoris. Everything labeled for you. And I saw these wipes at Target, and it made me think about you and how knowing anatomical terminology is helpful. Female erectile tissues. So, erect means to become full of blood and basically engorged. And I just like emphasizing that this happens in females along with males. Even though you normally can't see it, except for like erect nipples, it still happens in females. We already talked about the clitoris and how it contains nerve endings that contribute to female sexual arousal. And something we haven't mentioned yet are other glands called the bulb of the vestibule. And when these become erect, they become larger, and that might help the female be able to kind of grip penis during copulation. And then that's a view of the glands we already talked about, the greater vestibular glands that produce mucus and help keep everything moist and provide lubrication. And then finally, we are going to talk about mammary glands. Your mammary glands are actually modified sweat glands, so technically they belong in the integumentary system or the skin system. Starting from the outside, there's like a kind of a darker pigmented circle called the areola, and the nipple is located in the center of that. And the areola normally looks kind of bumpy because it has lots of sebaceous glands that produce oil that help keep the nipple from babies basically like cracking and drying up, especially during breastfeeding. And then if we go inside, the breast itself is made of lobes. Each mammary gland can contain anywhere from 15 to 25 lobes. And if we zoom in to a lobe there, the lobe is full of lobules that contain alveoli. Alveoli are like little air sacs, like in the lungs. So if you look, every little brown sac right there is an alveoli that actually produces the milk. And then after the milk is made, it travels up a lactiferous duct to the nipple where it's able to be released. Here is another view along with a great article down there, 5 interesting facts about nipples. You should check that out. And here is a nice comparison of this would be a breast in a female that's like never been pregnant and is not lactating. And then over here, this would be a lactating female, and we can see that all of her lobes have basically become enlarged and full of milk. I like to mention this because if you've never been pregnant before, then the size of your breast is pretty much due to fat tissue. So hopefully that eliminates any feeling bad about the size of your breast because they're just like facts of fact. Finally, physiology, the female sexual response. The initial phase, a lot of things happen. The clitoris, the vaginal mucosa, which is the inside of the vagina, the bulbs of the vestibule, and the breasts are all going to engorge with blood, and some of those structures will actually become erect, like the nipples. And the glands are going to be able to secrete mucus that lubricates the vestibule, facilitating intercourse. And then sometimes, after all of that stuff happens, the female experiences an orgasm where the uterus contracts rhythmically, and we have all the same systemic changes that happened in a male, like increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, increased breathing rate. Different from a male, though, there is no ejaculation and there's no refractory period. The refractory period is the time when a male cannot achieve another orgasm. Females don't have this, so females can have multiple orgasms in a row. It's also worth noting that orgasm is not necessary for conception. So a lot of times, male and female can have sex, and the female is actually never going to go to the final phase or the orgasm phase. Here's a video. If you're concerned about going to the gynecologist, feel free to ask me questions about this. And yeah, please let me know about all your questions, guys. Thank you.